Thanks for joining us for today's episode. But before we start the show, just a quick reminder that in addition to our podcast feed, we also sponsor events in physical places like live podcasts, panel discussions, and programs featuring art, music, film, and other such mediums. And we also host live events online where listeners are welcome to join in. Check out our website to see if we have any live events coming up to a place near you or any virtual events you can join in as well. Or maybe you have an idea for collaboration. Feel free to get in touch with us and share your thoughts. But for now, let's get into the show. Thank you all for being here for today's panel discussion titled Trajectories in Flux, Interrupted Paths, Aspirations Ahead. We're incredibly fortunate to have a group of passionate individuals joining this talk, each deeply involved in their respective fields, as we will soon hear in the discussion that follows. Before we begin, let me say a brief word. Before the coup, Myanmar was moving slowly but surely towards reform after decades of stagnation and oppression under a succession of brutal military regimes. However, this progress was uneven. While economic growth and political reforms provided new opportunities for some, others, such as ethnic minorities and marginalized communities, remained largely excluded, facing continued discrimination, conflict, and limited access to essential resources. The transition was far from smooth, and many of the gains were fragile, with systemic issues still deeply entrenched. Still, it represented a shift towards greater civic participation, increased access to information, and a cautious optimism that Myanmar could move toward a more open and inclusive society. Then in 2021, the coup shattered this fragile process, throwing the country into crisis, widespread repression, economic collapse, and devastating setbacks in every sector. The resistance to the coup has persisted for over 4 years now, and people across Myanmar steadfastly are adapting through new forms of organization, mobilization, and survival, despite relentless crackdowns. The cost has been devastating. Thousands have been killed, tens of thousands imprisoned, and literally millions are displaced as the military wages a brutal campaign of violence and suppression. Yet, despite everything, the resistance endures, an extraordinary testament to resilience and determination in the face of immense hardship. Those fighting for a post-Tatmadaw future envision a nation built on justice, inclusivity, and the establishment of democratic principles. This holds real potential, though the road ahead will require collective resilience, inclusivity, and a deep commitment to rebuilding the sectors most affected. So as we look towards the future, the question remains, what must be done to restore the gains, address the gaps, and truly move towards a more equitable and stable society? As we discuss these issues ahead, we will hear from individuals who have not only witnessed these changes, but have been actively engaged in responding to them. This conversation is not just about what has been lost, but about the resilience, efforts, and strategies that continue to emerge despite the obstacles. We'll explore how these shifts have shaped each of their fields, and most importantly, what must happen next in a post-coup Myanmar to ensure a return to progress and stability. In this panel, we're going to be exploring 6 key areas, tracing their trajectories over the years, assessing their current state, and considering where they might lead in the future. These areas are digital safety, energy, economy, food security, journalism, and education. We'll begin with brief introductions from each panelist, giving insight into their background and the work they have been engaged in during these turbulent years. I thank you all again very much for being here, and I look forward to a meaningful and thought-provoking discussion.
Thanks so much for having us here, Joa. And my name is Lei Win, and today I'm going to be talking about two topics because essentially I wear two hats most of the time. I'm a journalist specializing in food systems and climate change issues. That's my day job. I work as a lead reporter in the food systems newsroom of Lighthouse Reports, which is a non-profit investigative news outlet. And I also run my own newsletter on this topic called Thin Ink. So I'm going to be talking about food systems and food security issues. But I also happen to have been born and raised in Burma, Myanmar as well. I've been mentoring a number of exiled newsrooms for the past 18 months or so. And I'm also the co-founder of a non-profit storytelling project on Myanmar called the Kite Tales. And we've been supporting struggling journalists and illustrators for Myanmar since 2022, a year after the coup. So I'm going to be talking also about journalism.
My name is Sean Turnell. I've been researching Myanmar, Burma for about, 35 years now. And in that role, I'm mainly focused on the economy. I know I'm an economist by profession, and so that was my focus. But I guess probably most pertinently for this conversation, from 2016 to 2021, I served as economic advisor to the state councillor, Aung San Suu Kyi, and helped her and her key reformers drive through some of the reforms and confronted many of the difficulties along the way. Come the coup, and I was in Yangon and arrested by the incoming SAC junta and imprisoned for nearly 2 years until finally being released in late 2022. I haven't stopped my Burma work. In fact, if anything, it's increased tempo, I would say. So I continue to analyse Myanmar, Burma's economy, and the directions that the SAC junta, unfortunately, are taking it.
Hello, my name is Bradley. I'm a PhD candidate at School of Public Policy, Chiang University. My interest is exploring the digital repression and resistance and what are the impact of those on the societies. I have been working in digital rights sector for over a decade, and I also analyze how people in Myanmar use alternative communication technologies to resist repression as part of my work as a senior analyst at the Myanmar Internet Project. So I would like to disclaim that the opinions and ideas I will be describing in this panel are not related to either Myanmar Internet Project or the School of Public Policy, Chiang University. These words will be my own opinions and ideas. And I'm very excited to talk with these great people from different contexts. And thank you very much, Insight Myanmar team, for giving me this opportunity.
Hi, I'm Guillaume De Langre. I was an energy advisor to the former civilian government from 2018 until 2020. And today I am doing a PhD at the University of Oxford, and I'm an independent consultant, still very much working on many things Myanmar. Looking forward to the chat today.
Hi everyone, I'm very honored to be here. My name is Thura, and I'm one of the co-founders of Spring University Myanmar, which is now providing alternative education programs for Myanmar youths. We were established right after the coup as a response to the military coup in 2021. And prior to that, I was part of the Students' Union and the student advocacy movement in Yangon, and as part of the youth advocacy activities in Myanmar prior to the coup. Very glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much all for your participation and giving a brief background. And let's move directly into our first question. To begin this discussion, let's take a step back and reflect on the state of each sector before the coup. Before 2021, during Myanmar's so-called transition period, various reforms were taking shape and progress was being made in some key areas, though inconsistencies and challenges definitely still remained. So for each of you, in your respective field, how would you characterize the direction your sector was headed before the coup? What were the key developments, opportunities, and challenges you witnessed during that time?
Thanks for that, Joa. I'm going to focus on food security or food insecurity on this one. But I first want to sort of unpack the terminology, because a lot of the time when people hear that word, they think that it means there isn't enough food. But the fact is, food security actually has 4 dimensions, right? And availability, whether there is enough food, is just one out of those 4. There also need to be what is called economic and physical access to food, the ability of our bodies to utilize such food to make the most of the various nutrients that such food has, and the stability of the other 3 dimensions over time. And the reason I'm explaining this is because I want to make 5 broad points about food security or insecurity in Myanmar before the transition as well as during the transition. The first point that I think it's really important for us to remember is that Myanmar has generally been a food surplus country, which means we actually produce more than we consume, particularly when it comes to rice and pulses. And we've also generally been a net food exporter. Surprising, right? Because Myanmar for a very long time has a really high hunger or undernourishment rate. But did you also know that Myanmar met the MDG, the Millennium Development Goal, the precursor to the Sustainable Development Goals, one Millennium Development Goal to halve the number of people who suffer from hunger between 1990 and 2015. Myanmar met that goal. Because in that 25 years, hunger actually dropped from 62%, so that's more than 1 in 2 people, to just 14%, which is 1 in 7. So that sounds very good, right? Like we're doing great stuff. But that number, 1 in 7 people going to bed hungry, actually didn't budge for the next 4 to 5 years until COVID. So again, like you said, there were developments, but inconsistencies and challenges that is a perfect example of it. And then also, if you disaggregate that data, hunger was still a big problem in rural areas and for minority groups, even though the national data says that only 14% was going hungry or undernourished. Last point, malnutrition was still a massive problem, again, particularly in rural areas and minority groups. For example, we haven't managed to significantly reduce stunting in children, and stunting actually affects both physical and cognitive development and often causes generational impacts and have lifelong impacts as well. Anemia in women of reproductive age actually increased between 2012 and 2016, so things didn't improve for that particular part. At the same time, adult obesity also increased over that same period. So this is all to say that a lot of things were improving, but there was still a lot of needs and massive discrepancies between urban and rural areas and the more affluent Burma areas and the peripheries, right? I have always said that food insecurity in modern day Myanmar is actually a result of political failure and intentional neglect, because in all sense and purposes, we had enough food because, we're a food surplus country. Now, we can argue about whether the food that we were producing was nutritious and healthy, but to me, the biggest problems were that there were problems with access and stability. So food was either too expensive for many people, or it just wasn't accessible, especially if you were living in a remote village in Chin or Rakhine, or in a conflict zone in Shan or Kachin. Right? And emergent evidence was also suggesting at that time that more than half of the population couldn't afford nutrient-rich foods. Again, meaning access. They couldn't afford it. It wasn't that food wasn't available. At the same time, consumption of oil, sugar, and processed foods were increasing because these were cheap calories, but they also have an impact on nutrition, which is why we were seeing obesity as well as anemia increasing at the same time. That's why hunger numbers hadn't really declined as well. Having said all that, things were changing. So let's take rice, for example, right? We're a nation obsessed with rice, as you all know. Instead of saying hello, we say, have you had rice? But from the 1960s onwards, successive governments have been obsessed with recapturing that glory of being the rice bowl of Southeast Asia. And they anchored agricultural policies on rice, right? And anything from loans to infrastructure to services to farmers, all was based on rice. That meant a lot of the food production centered on rice at the expense of more nutrient-rich foods. But the vast majority of rice that we actually eat in Myanmar is white rice, which actually isn't very nutritious. So when I met officials at Moali, which is the Ministry of Agriculture, in 2019, 2 years before the coup, they were actually embarking on a 5-year nutrition plan to change these eating habits, and that includes diversifying what we grow so that consumers can access a more varied food basket and farmers can increase their income. They'd signed an agreement with the UN Agriculture Agency, the FAO, where one of the major goals, again, was diversification. They were working with American and Japanese researchers on climate proofing Myanmar agriculture. They were talking about the importance of indigenous groups. I saw a report that a Moali official actually wrote about how Myanmar has recorded 18,000 plant species so far, and many of them were highly nutritious. So they were thinking of how do we make them more appealing to both consumers and farmers. Now, the private sector and the aid agencies were also really active in terms of improving food security, the 4 dimensions of it. And I remember going to both the dry zone and the delta many times, the 2 main cropping regions in Myanmar, particularly with proximity designs. And it's a social enterprise that works with small-scale farmers in Myanmar. And they were helping the farmers ways to conserve water, not to overuse fertilizers, and improve soil fertility. And I saw with my own eyes how hungry farmers were to learn these new things and to learn how to improve all of it. So it was a mixed picture. There were a lot of challenges, but we were making headway and we were thinking about tackling some of those big challenges in the right way as well.
In the introduction, Myanmar was described at the end of the transition period as being in a state of cautious optimism. And that's the phrase that I would use for the economy as well. It was a massive task that was being undertaken from 2016 to 2021 that was nothing less than the wholesale transformation of the economy. I think it's as well known, of course, Myanmar was very much the laggard of Southeast Asia. It was the country that missed out on being one of the tigers, and the overall plan of the government when it came in 2016 was to bring in reforms sufficient enough to turn Myanmar into what we used to like to call the last and best of the tigers. Of course, it was an aspiration, but that likewise hints at the ambition, but also the task ahead, which clearly was a massive one. Now, it never achieved those ambitions, I hasten to add, which of course is no secret and wouldn't have even if the coup hadn't taken place. But substantial progress, some significant achievements have been made across that period. I think that's especially the case with respect to fiscal policy, or simply what we know as government spending and taxation, the broad government finances of the country, if you like. I often call that the original sin of economic policy making in Myanmar, because what's traditionally happened in Myanmar is that the state has tried to claim too many resources, too much of the country's overall output. And usually those resources, of course, are employed not in socially constructive ways, such as health and education and the like, but traditionally ploughed into the military. So that was the thing that we needed to change, was to make the country fiscally sustainable and to reorientate some of that expenditure. Now, as it turned out, the overall story was an incredibly good one. And the story of an overtaking state was much reduced, such that Myanmar's budget deficits, which have been just chronic and financed largely by the highly destructive way of just printing money, they'd been eliminated by 2019, and the forecasts ahead were extraordinarily optimistic. Now, as it turned out, of course, in 2020 and into 2021, COVID arrived, and that put a huge hole in the budget again. But that in itself was actually a positive sign, because in a sense, the frugality of the years leading into that meant that the state had the funds to deal with COVID when it arrived. Now, as it turned out after the coup, of course, the regime coming in just basically gave up a lot of those resources. But in any case, just to say that the country was reasonably well placed to deal with disasters such as COVID, as well as having a fiscal framework that going forward would have been better than it ever had been, I think, in developing long-term investment and long-term infrastructure and the like. So that was a good sign, a good achievement. Another really good standout achievement, I think, was reorienting the overall economic approach to China. Myanmar had been one of those countries that was very much under China's shadow, but in particular in relation to the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. The trouble was that relationship before 2016 had replicated the highly damaging relationships that were characteristic right across the region, but particularly for countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan and so on, in that it was thoroughly unequal and absolutely laden with so-called debt diplomacy. Now, in the case of Myanmar, there was a number of particularly bad projects, but the elephant of them all was the Jiao Pu deep sea port and special economic zone, which was going to cost Myanmar over $10.8 billion and indebted the country for generations ahead. It didn't make financial sense. It didn't make much economic sense at all either. And so our assessment of that program was that it would have made Myanmar very heavily indebted and would have, at some point, driven the country to some form of insolvency and would have then, as a consequence, seen the surrender of the Jiao Pu port to China, just in the way that happened in Sri Lanka with the Hambantota report. So a really dire situation. Top priority for the government was to approach China about that project and renegotiate it. And that was done, and this $10.8 billion project was converted into a $1.1 billion project, very much sized for Myanmar's needs rather than perhaps China's needs. But nonetheless, China agreed to it. It was a singular success, I think, in the area of economic diplomacy, and something that was a real debt diplomacy disaster turned into something at least mildly productive for Myanmar. So that one, I think, stood out, and a particularly high achievement, I think, given that Myanmar didn't have much of a hand in these negotiations and yet achieved an outcome like it did. Incidentally, we received, and when I say we, let me just pay tribute at the moment in all the things I've been describing. Of course, it's a cohort of economic reformers, usually at the deputy minister level, incredibly credentialed, vibrant, full of energy and so on, who were pushing these through. And they were all Burmese. People like myself were attempting to help them in various ways, but this was these reforms very much a homegrown phenomenon. Anyway, the reformers used to get many requests from many other countries in Southeast Asia attempting to replicate Myanmar's success in dealing with China, which I think gives us some idea of the success that this renegotiation achieved. Many other reforms along the way, reforms basically to try and channel resources away from the military into health, education. Only fitful successes here. One of the big problems throughout the whole transition period, of course, was that under the Constitution, the civilian government could not touch military expenditure. In fact, it could not even question military expenditure. So that gives us some indication of how difficult the reforms were, given that the biggest single item of expenditure is beyond the control of the civilian government. Nonetheless, there was, as I said, certainly a big improvement on the overall fiscal front, but also some improvement on allocations to health, education, basic infrastructure, etc. Reforms, all sorts of other areas. By the end of the period of the NLD government, 2020, late 2020 into early 2021, resistance to reforms were becoming very apparent. One of the big problems of economic reform is that some people lose. And those people who do lose tend to be the most powerful people in previous regimes. And of course, that's the point of economic reform, is to fundamentally change things. But this means changing power relationships. So there was much unhappiness amongst many of Myanmar's cronies towards the end of the NLD government period, particularly in relation to banking and financial sector reform. Some of those banks had a lot to lose, in short, from some of their activities, which did little to advantage Myanmar, but did much to advantage the cronies themselves. So, as we were starting to encroach on their territory, though, much complaints came from them. And of course, many of them were closely aligned to the military itself. Likewise, of course, closely aligned to the military were the two giant military-owned corporations, Myanmar Economic Corporation, Myanmar Economic Holdings. Both of those had a lot to lose from the reform story itself. So, not surprising that the whole tempo of resistance, heat, beginning to rise in the country politically over the economic reforms as we're moving through 2020 into the elections and then in the period immediately after that. So that was a challenge. Probably the biggest challenge, however, were the terrible atrocities taking place in Rakhine State by the military. Now, there are various things the civilian government tried to do to stop those atrocities. They were not successful, and there's all sorts of arguments about the degree, the stress that those atrocities received, etc. But just to say, for the moment anyway, that they certainly were the responsibility of the man who currently rules Myanmar in the form of Min Aung Hlaing. But I think the story of Rakhine also illustrates, I think, a bigger problem that persisted right through the period of the transition, which was no solution was ever really worked out on a proper and just fiscal federalism. I think there was a broad assumption that if the economy came good, that would allow sufficient resources to bring about such justice in a fiscal framework, but it never really happened up to the coup itself.
The previous panelists also mentioned a lot experiences and knowledge about what was happening in Myanmar. And as they have mentioned profoundly, we were going through a lot of transitions, and there are also inconsistencies. So, when it comes to digital rights and this digital transformation sector, before the 2021 coup, um, I was working on particularly digital security and digital rights, particularly. And in terms of progress, first, I saw the progress in policy advocacy and the policy process. It has been improved um, with the um, it has been improved with the reforms of the government entities by the NLD government. Um, the collaboration between the civil societies and the ministries has improved. And when I started working in this area in 2015, it was quite challenging to get a chance to meet up with the top level decision makers, such as ministers, permanent secretaries, and etc. They had their own ways, and there are a lot of red tapes in each and every steps, from sending your invitation or your policy brief to providing gifts to the officials. Later, the process became much more smoother, and even the small civil society organizations like us could reach out to the officials. And in addition, the Aung San Suu Kyi government brought in highly educated technocrats into the decision-making levels of the ministries. Therefore, the conversations between officials and CSOs with niche interests like us became smoother. And also, what I remember was the last event that we organized. The biggest event was the Myanmar Digital Rights Forum, and where the government officials, the law enforcement officials, and the human rights groups and digital rights groups like us, we were um, having a lot of productive and also debating about different point of views, and we were defending our own perspectives out of our lungs. And after that, we um, talk in the tea breaks and uh, l- laughed on a lot of things, and it was becoming quite democratic. So, in terms of digital transformation, on the other hand, the conversation were around Industry 4.0, universal access, public digital literacies, etc. And to state it more concretely, in 2019, 2020 was the time of the shift of discourse from barely talking about accessibility, internet penetration, to after access dialogues. Like, okay, if we have um, enough penetration and enough affordability of the internet, what are we going to do? So it's about digital economy, smart governance, e-commerce platforms, universal secure payments, etc. And the improvement of infrastructure can also be seen in the telecom sector. The regulator, Post and Telecom Department, PTD, developed new categories of ISP license, and along with that, the small local ISP came into the market, and the competition was so intense and became very lively. Like every company is competing each other, offering better and better services, and also rural internet facilities are also in the beginning stage, in the assessment stage. Um, with the organizations like Alliance for Affordable Internet, A4AI allied with um, local digital rights groups, implementing the Universal Service Fund, and and before that, the Post and Telecommunication Department and the ministry came up with a universal service strategy in 2018. And in 2019, 2020 were the phases of uh, going into the field and doing assessments. And also, there is another thing that the competition in the CSR projects of the big telecoms. It has made a lot of opportunities for young people, public digital literacy, SME developments, etc. And for example, Telenor had the Lighthouse projects where local entrepreneurs can apply for a small grant, and the project provides internet printers, laptops, desktops, and other basic IT devices, as well as the digital literacy course to provide it to the youth in the community for free. On the other hand, uh, Ooredoo was giving away digital devices, free call while the internet shutdowns, and donating to the COVID centers, etc. So that was the scene of everything. Like uh, there are a lot of like roadblocks and challenges, but things are going. Some things are in progress already. We cannot deny it. But there are also a lot of challenges at that time. And so the one significant thing was we were in 2019, 2020, we were already talking about the internet shutdowns in Rakhine and Chin state. Internet shutdown was not the post-coup, not only the post-coup behavior. Before the coup, there was internet shutdowns, and we activist groups were asking for the end of the internet shutdowns in Rakhine and Chin states, and also we were working on the abolishing the 66D of the telecommunication law, which fiercely struck down the freedom of speech of the activists. Lots of activists were sued by the 60 for being vocal about politics on social media, Facebook especially. And looking back to some of those memories in 2020, we were also um, busy with the election. We were doing what we call the war room, starting from a week before the election with two teams, one social media monitoring team and digital security team. The pro-military groups were going full on social media weaponization, spreading fake news. On the other hand, the state-sponsored hacker groups were doing the image spoofing of the parliament websites, prominent media websites like Myanmar Now. They also tried to hack the Union Election Committee's websites. So those were the challenges we were tackling, and also another challenge that we were facing in that time was the enforcement of uh, using the Unicode font. In 2019, MOTC already announced official usage of Unicode ending the Zorji Unicode battle. However, some percentage of the population still resists changing to Unicode. So a lot of improvements, a lot of progress in the very short time uh, we got for the stable era, like from 2016 to 2021, we were going into uh, becoming a democratic society, and also there were challenges, a lot of challenges for us before the coup.
Yeah, it's been fascinating, as well as heartbreaking, actually, just to hear, how the trajectory of the country on some of these different sectors, and I think journalism saw a major shift. In some ways, I feel like it's similar to the digital transformation that Bradley was talking about. Again, lots of challenges, but also massive changes. And here I actually want to tell you a little of a personal story. So I used to hyperventilate every time I came back to Myanmar as a journalist, because I know what the junta thinks of journalists, particularly independent journalists. And, I spend most of my career outside of the country, but, I still carry a Myanmar passport, and which means that I was able to come back in and out much easier than foreign journalists, because I don't have to wait for visas, etc. But I was also very aware that if foreign journalists were found out, they would just be deported. I would probably go to jail. So, for example, I remember coming back right after Cyclone Nargis hit to report for Reuters, and I couldn't really breathe until I was out of the airport and in the car on the way home. And the same process would repeat, right? When I leave, I'd be hyperventilating all the way to the airport and could only breathe properly once the plane had taken off. And, we all had to fill in. Remember those sort of lending cards that we all had to fill in for the immigration? And there would be a little part where you have to put your occupation. And I would put marketing or consultancy. I would never write journalist, because I thought that would be asking for trouble. I just didn't feel safe, even though things were changing a lot. By about 2011, 2012, there was a proliferation of media outlets. Pre-publication censorship was demolished in 2012. That was a massive thing. And legacy exiled newsrooms had returned to settle back in Myanmar. Thousands of young people entered the world of journalism, and there was this sense of hope and optimism and gung-ho-ness, to take advantage of this new openness. And a lot of that had to do with the arrival of mobile phones and the internet and this whole, digital world that literally opened up Myanmar to the outside world and with each other as well in the country. That was a big thing. And after a year or two of regularly coming back to do reporting, I started writing in that form, that immigration form, that I work for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, without actually saying what I was doing. But I think, that shows the progression in which I was feeling a little bit more comfortable about being upfront with what I was doing. And then in 2015, before the elections, I actually wrote correspondent in that card under occupation. And, I felt a massive sense of relief and so happy, because it felt like a milestone. It felt like I can finally be open about who I am in my own country. Of course, it wasn't all great, right? We all knew that there was a lot of misinformation. What came with it, the opening and the internet, the mobile phones and the social media was a lot of misinformation and hate speech. And, fake news killed people in Burma or Myanmar before it became a buzzword in the West. Journalism was still a very dangerous job. The military was still extremely hostile to the media. But like I said, we were also starting to really push the envelope and write about things that were taboo, right? I remember asking difficult questions to the then presidential spokesperson, Yeto, at the East West Center's media conference in 2014. And that was the first major international media seminar held in Myanmar. It was, again, another big milestone. And when we set up Myanmar Now in 2015, right, me, Lei Win, and Zani Win, the first story that we published was about Swan Ashin as pro-government thugs. We wrote about Mabada's campaign against Muslim slaughterhouses. We wrote about prostitution as a result of poverty. We questioned the race and religion laws and why nuns are discriminated. These are considered controversial issues, but we were able to publish them, and actually other news outlets republished them as well. There was a lot of alignment between the media and the public until 2016, because both were critical of the then government, the USDP, right? And I remember saying at a diplomatic function after the election that this honeymoon period probably isn't going to last, because our role as journalists is to hold power to account. I know it sounds cliche, but that is really what it is. Regardless of which group is in power, you have to hold power to account, because otherwise we're just doing public relations or propaganda. But now that a very popularly elected government is in power, how open are the people and the policymakers to criticism? And I think we actually started seeing the strains and the tensions pretty quickly. So tensions within the journalistic community, tensions between the public and the media, and yes, tensions between the civilian NLD government and the media. Of course, the tension with the military never went away. And in fact, I think it sort of worsened in some ways, because they probably felt like they were losing some control. But if we thought that the civilian government was going to be a champion of the free media, well, some of us were disappointed, because the media was still seen as a threat, right? And it was a pretty thankless job that paid very poorly. Let me say, Myanmar journalists are paid extremely poorly and invited so much hostility from pretty much all quarters of the society. Just look at what happened to my former colleagues, Walone and Josu, right? And I have friends, journalist friends, who literally have to leave their jobs because they were hounded by other journalists. I have other journalist friends who faced attempts on their lives, right? And there was this prevailing school of thought in Myanmar that criticizing a popularly elected government is almost tantamount to betrayal. That specific idea I find both pernicious and an antithesis to a democracy, but that idea persists, unfortunately, to this day. So yeah, it was an extremely vibrant scene with lots of great strides that were made in terms of having a plurality of media outlets. Journalists learned to ask difficult questions. And that's a big thing, right? Because we are still a deeply conservative country where age and position automatically confers respect. So being able to ask difficult questions to military generals, to policymakers, to members of parliament, to ministers, that's a big thing. We were also starting to cover topics that were previously considered controversial. And that ranges from official corruption and military abuses to the civil wars and social issues that, the previous military dictators had tried hard to ignore. But there was also an undercurrent of danger that they could all be taken away from you. Of course, having said all of that, what happened at that time during that transition and the strides that were made, the progress that were made was still massive. And it is night and day to what happened after the coup, which I will talk about later.
In the energy sector, I think the transition period was a very novel moment for anything relating to infrastructure, as Bradley mentioned earlier about telecoms, but also in the energy sector. I think there are a few key parameters of that time to bear in mind before comparing to the post-coup energy crisis. First, demand was growing much faster than expected, and much faster than supply. The second thing was that gas production was expected to start falling quickly at the end of the decade, around 2020, 2021. And at the time, about half of electricity in Myanmar came from domestic gas. So they would pump gas off, mostly offshore, bring it onshore with pipelines, burn it, produce electricity. And that was about half of the electricity in the country. And what we knew at the time was that that was going to dry up, that the reserves were going to run out at the big gas field that produces most of the power for Yangon and its surroundings. That gas field was going to start to run out at the start of the 2020s. And so that meant, okay, we need to find a solution there. And I'll get into that in a minute. The third thing was that the Ministry of Electricity and Energy was heavily subsidizing electricity consumption for everyone. Myanmar had some of the lowest electricity prices in the world, the lowest electricity prices in Southeast Asia by a mile. And it couldn't afford that. And the problem was that when you're subsidizing electricity like that, it can get out of control very, very quickly, especially at a time when demand is growing very fast. And so back in 2017, for example, the 2017, 2018, they were losing around $200 to $400 million just in electricity subsidies, most of which were going to large residential users in cities who had aircon. And so you had this very unfair system where the state was struggling to build the power grid to get power to the villages, but at the same time was subsidizing large houses in Yangon and Mandalay. And of course, the big elephant in the room at the time was that only a third of Myanmar's population had access to electricity, to grid electricity. So back in 2015, 33% of households had grid electricity, which was one of the lowest rates in Asia in general, and one of the least electrified countries in the world. So what that meant was that the transition governments, I would say both the Thein Sein administration and the NLD administration, set a few priorities. The first was the one that was communicated a lot to the population about electrifying the whole country by 2030. The second one was to build as much new power plants as possible and to find new energy sources, right? So because the existing gas resources were going to dry up, needed to get new energy sources, whether it was new gas or diversify and invest in new kinds of energy, whether it was solar or wind or hydro or so on and so forth. And finally, the goal was to also increase electricity prices to cover the costs, at least to cover the costs. It didn't mean that they weren't going to keep subsidizing poor consumers, but at least to stop subsidizing rich households and large consumers in urban areas. So the strategy of the former minister who recently passed away, U Win Kang, was initially from 2016 to 2019, I would say, to go through the existing channels to let the bureaucracy try to come up with solutions to the problem. That didn't really work out, and it was extremely slow. Nothing was really moving forward. There were bottlenecks everywhere. The bureaucracy was very reluctant to cooperate with the changes at the political level. A lot of the procedures were completely obsolete, procedures that had been designed for approving or planning energy systems on a kind of government-to-government basis or government-to-company basis were completely obsolete when it came to a flood of hundreds of foreign companies coming in with their proposals and all kinds of different kinds of contracts that the bureaucrats had never seen and so on and so forth. So in 2019, the ministers saw that they were heading for a drop in gas supply very soon and nothing to compensate for that. So there was going to be this huge energy crisis in the early 2020s, and there was no solution in the pipeline to avoid it. And that's when they started approving these emergency projects, emergency gas plants. They decided to import gas from abroad on ships. They decided to build a lot of solar plants, 29. They decided on a fast track procedure informally, but basically they accelerated the approval process for projects, and they increased electricity prices in 2019. That was the situation when the coup happens in 2021. And I think maybe we can discuss later on how all of that plays out and interacts with the political crisis.
And when it comes to the education sector, I'll be drawing from both my personal experiences working and being involved in the student movement in between 2010 and 2020, as well as some of the guiding frameworks that the Ministry of Education, as well as the large majority of the education stakeholders were using on. So. Just a bit of my background. So I finished high school in Yangon in 2012, and I joined an engineering university. It was a 6-year program. So from 2012 to 2017, 18, I was involved in the policies and the student union reestablishment within my own campus, as well as trying to coordinate with other student leaders from other universities, as well as youth organizations who operate outside of the campuses. So seems like the education reform and the education sector reform processes were one of the priorities of the NLD during the 2015 election, and rightly so. They did try to invest more and seek more assistance and inputs for the education sector reform, starting from public consultations and trying to accommodate more actors to be involved, such as student union leaders, teacher union leaders, as well as from the civil society organizations to be a part of this new the National Education Strategic Plan, which ran from 2016 to 2020, and there was several plans underway for the next phase of that strategic plan, which would have ran from 2021 to 2030, but it appears that it might not see the light of day. So even historically speaking, the education sector has seen a number of proactive movements from the students, especially the university students, who have led massive student rallies and protests, and who were also part of the initiating movement in 1988, as well as in 1974, 1962, and we go way back to the colonial times as part of the nationalist movement from the British. So the most recent of those student protests happened in 2015. That was in response to the National Education Law, which was passed in the Parliament in 2014. So it was still under the previous administration, the USDP government, and there seemed to be some level of compromise reached with the student protesters back then. So the major demands from the students, even at that time, were about allowing the unionization of students, as well as the faculty members and the university administration, as well as as well as pathways to include ethnic minorities in the national education framework, be it through the mother tongue-based education programs for the children, as well as trying to figure out potential pathways for student mobilities, for students and teachers to switch between different systems that exist within the country. So when we talk about education, the major institution would be the Ministry of Education in Naypyidaw, but even before the coup, there were a variety of ethnic education institutes that were active within the various ethnic controlled areas as well as along the border, who are out of the central government's education systems, and they have always been sort of a fragmented system of different education service providers within the country. So with that National Education Strategic Plan, there were some efforts to reform and push for more drastic measures in terms of the curriculum development, trying to integrate 21st century skills and modernizing the school infrastructure for hundreds and thousands of schools that exist across the country. So prior to the coup, it was regarded that the Ministry of Education and in particular the Department of Basic Education was regarded as the largest institution in the country because they had around 10 or 11 million registered students, as well as around 400,000 teachers. So they were holding on to a large chunk of the responsibility. And in terms of higher education, the reforms were more about trying to create autonomous universities that could operate freely from the detailed micromanagement from the Ministry of Education in Naypyidaw. So when we talk about faculty members or professors or someone in the academia in other countries, they would be regarded as individuals who are passionate about their respective discipline and try to pursue academic and research interests in their respective fields. Whereas in Myanmar, both for basic education and higher education, faculty members are generally considered more as a civil servant, as a bureaucrat, rather than a proper researcher or an academic. So this creates a number of problems when we're trying to improve or reform the education sector as a whole and trying to have a more student-focused approach in the teaching and trying to have more inclusive assessment frameworks for these learners. So this National Education Strategic Plan was focusing on addressing these challenges, trying to approach it as a systemic strengthening pathway. So trying to create an entirely different, if I may, that were operating before the NLD government came into power. And there were also a number of international development partners that were sort of helping and that were providing both financial and technical assistance in the consultation processes and in coming up with a comprehensive strategic plan. So that included UN agencies, multilateral development partners, as well as bilateral support from, say, the British Council and the US Embassy, USAID. And then there were also a lot of promising pathways for Myanmar students and Myanmar education platforms to gain more recognition and more connectivity with global and regional education associations, such as the ASEAN University Network, which is like the ASEAN University Network, which is a collection of selected universities from ASEAN countries. It is not entirely comprehensive. It's around 3 or 5 universities per country, but it did seem like a good pathway for Myanmar universities to get more recognition and for the Myanmar students and teachers to gain more access to international practices. Now, even within this framework, there seems to be some forms of inconsistencies and inequalities, I might add, because if we would look at these humanitarian support or multilateral, bilateral development assistance, they tend to follow a path of being under the economic development theme. Now, there were all sorts of assistance and funding that were flowing into Myanmar in the previous decade, and there was a lot of initiatives in the political and democratic transition, with the peace process, the ceasefire agreement, and the constitution reform. But education being under economic development also meant that many of the priorities and the policies brought forward often tend to miss some of the nuances of the political negotiations that were happening forward. Because if you will look at the National Education Strategic Plan, there weren't many components on how the ministry could integrate the already existing ethnic language schools that are serving many of the rural populations and ethnic populations and those youth and children that are in the refugee camps along the border. There also seem to be practical limitations on how the ministry could integrate them all at the same time. I think they appear to have considered that as more of a gradual integration of various systems one by one, whereas in other parts of the education reform, like the curriculum development or the assessment frameworks, they tend to have a lot more drastic measures when they were planning these reforms. And the last sort of component that did not get sort of formalized or legalized into the education reform process would be the private sector. So many of the schools and colleges, everything was under the ministry, but for the private institutes, be it a nonprofit, private sort of nonprofit private organizations or a for-profit private commercial institutes, there weren't any ways for them to get official education license within that framework. It didn't mean that there weren't any. There were already a very, very vibrant and somewhat more efficient form of schools and education programs that are being offered by these organizations. They were already forming their own sort of loose networks and connections on their own, but it has not yet been included in the government's education plan as of now. So yeah, this would be the summary of the education sector prior to the coup.
Thank you all so much for sharing. It's really quite remarkable to hear all of this together. And this is one of the reasons why we wanted to have a panel of this nature. Here at Insight Myanmar, we often remark on how we take these deep dives into these different areas. And we're at this nexus of all this information coming in and on our end trying to figure out where it all goes together and where one insight or background from one guest might connect to another, and then sharing that with our audience. And so that gave rise to this idea, which is happening now, of wanting to bring together these different viewpoints, short deep dives, we can say, into these respective areas, and to have a conversation with that together, which is what's happening. And I think it's really remarkable, reflecting on what has been shared to this point, to think that all of this is happening simultaneously just in these areas we've talked about. There's so many other areas that we could address that we're not, and it's just this very brief snapshot into these respective fields. It gives, I'm sure, a lot of us and a lot of our listeners a lot of food for thought. So then moving on and shifting our focus to the present moment, the next question I would like to ask each of you is, how has the coup reshaped your area of focus? After 4 years of upheaval, resistance, and adaptation, what are the most pressing realities your sector faces today? What are the biggest obstacles? How serious and urgent are the challenges? And how have individuals and organizations found ways to navigate them?
So I'm going to cite figures from a UNDP report published in January on food security issues. Now, that report actually said that Myanmar is going through, and I quote, a profound poly crisis that has massively affected people's ability to both grow food and afford the food. It actually said that half of the population are living below the poverty line and another third just barely above it. It also said that 28% of households are eating less to cope with the situation. Just to emphasize this, that is more than 1 in 4 households who are eating less because of the coup, essentially. Now, the report also said that 16%, 1/6, of the country's rice growing area has been lost since 2021, mostly as a result of conflict and flooding. And it also found that essential commodities, including rice, vegetables, and meat or animal source foods, because that includes eggs as well, are becoming increasingly unaffordable. So one example it gave is of chicken, which is typically the least expensive meat in Myanmar. It actually recorded a 91% year-on-year increase, and it has become even more expensive than beef. The UN in general also said that nearly 20 people, that's more than 1 in 3 people in Myanmar, will be needing assistance in 2025. So these are really big and grim numbers, right? And we were just talking about how, yes, food insecurity has improved, but undernourishment figures hasn't really budged. But that was still 1 in 7, 14%. We are now talking about the fact that more than 1 in 4 households are having to eat less, and a vast majority of the country are now living below the poverty line. So I double-checked some of the statistics with a veteran development professional who's been working with farmers for decades, and they said that statistics are really hard to come by these days, which of course is understandable, but also said that their own work with farmers across the country has shown that the sector is declining, and that it is very likely that these statistics are accurate. 2 of the biggest challenges for agriculture sector are the fact that increase in fuel and fertilizer prices, that has really hurt them. So what they do to cope is to cut the costs, right? And that include cutting the cost of cultivation. So they're cultivating less. And these high prices in fuel and fertilizer are going to be a problem in the future as well. It will continue to be a problem. The other big challenge is the insecurity. That has really disrupted farming activities. There are 2 major cropping regions in Myanmar, right? The Delta and the dry zone. The Delta used to be relatively calm in terms of security, but that is changing now because the Arakan army is making advances into the Irrawaddy region from Rakhine. So parts of the Delta are being affected by the conflict. As we all know, the dry zone has seen some of the biggest, most intense conflicts over the past 4 years. So farming there was very, very much disrupted, and parts of it remains so, because heavy fighting has continued. And of course, all of that has an impact on farm labor, right? Because remember, in Myanmar, much of our agriculture is still labor intensive. It's not yet mechanized. But conflict and the conscription law have really affected the availability of farm labor, because more and more people are leaving. They're leaving villages, they're leaving farming communities, they're leaving Myanmar, period. So even if farmers wanted to grow as much as they used to, there just isn't enough people to help them. So it also begs a larger question for the future. Who will be the next generation of farmers if we have hollowed out villages? So even if you are not affected by the conflict, the price rises, or the labor shortage, you still have to think about how the junta's trade policies, which are very ad hoc, and their policy making has been very much oriented towards the war economy, right? Extracting as much as possible to help them with the conflict. How all of that will affect your livelihood, because you need predictability to do business. And currently there's just none, even if that business is farming and agriculture and producing food, right? So those are the shorter term concerns, and they're big enough, but there are also longer term concerns, because this disruption doesn't just affect whether you can farm, whether there's enough people to farm, how much you can farm, because the disruption is also on agricultural research and development, also on investment in rural infrastructure and support that farmers need in terms of extension services. And this development professional told me, and I quote, if the agriculture sector keeps declining, Myanmar may become a net food importer. Now, another aspect is that Myanmar is highly vulnerable to climate disasters, and that's a major long-term concern, right? And we all know that extractive activities like deforestation and illegal mining have an impact on the ecosystems upon which our food production is based on. And those activities have been ramped up since the coup, because that's usually the way in which the military, put money in its coffers. That's how it finances its war machine. And the real concern is that, once these ecosystems, these fragile ecosystems and the environment is destroyed, what is going to happen to our ability to produce food and feed ourselves? What happens if there's another Nargis? And the last point is most recently what is happening with the dismantling of USAID. We are one step closer to the worst case scenario in terms of food insecurity and agriculture. Whatever little agricultural research and development with American universities and researchers and support is pretty much gone. That includes helping climate proof our food production. A lot of that work on climate adaptation and resilience will disappear, if not already. And the most worrying of all, of course, is the humanitarian assistance, of which food aid is a large part. If you look at the statistics, less than 40% of the UN humanitarian assistance plan for Myanmar last year was funded, less than 40%. Out of that 40%, nearly a third came from the US, USAID. That is more than the next two largest donors combined. So there are big questions around how do we continue food aid to some of the neediest people, along the different borders and inside the country, but also how do we continue with agriculture support and research and development? And currently, unfortunately, we don't have any answers.
In talking about the media a little while earlier, Thin used the expression night and day, and I think we can use that for the economy post-coup as well. In essence, there's been a complete collapse of the reform program and almost a complete collapse in the economy itself. And essentially what we've seen is the replacement of an economy oriented and policy oriented towards growth and development in favour of an economy that is really just based on the necessities of war. If we think about, and we have to think hard about any economic program offered by the SAC junta, really the only one they care about is how can they get the foreign exchange they need to buy the advanced weaponry, air-delivered munitions and the like that give them some advantage over the opposition. And that's really about it. We are not flooded with announcements of major programs to the extent that sometimes some arise. They're risible in their preparation and their likelihood. But in essence, the only thing they really care about is commandeering foreign exchange. Foreign exchange, munitions are almost synonyms in Myanmar today. And we see that in all sorts of practical ways, of course. The surrender requirements that people are required to make when they earn any sort of foreign currency, exporters, then mentioned agricultural exports and so on before, and highlighted the fact that, Burma was very much the rice bowl of Asia for generations, etc. There's no incentives in Myanmar anymore to be an exporter in the agricultural sector, nor anywhere else, because, of course, your foreign exchange is either going to be seized directly from you, or you're going to come under extraordinary scrutiny of the regime, and you need to be very careful about how you go about your cross-border flows, or you're going to be cheated in terms of the exchange rate that the regime will apply to any earnings. But that really is about it. That is the extent of economic policy making of the junta at the moment. Now, it's not surprising, given that that's their focus, to see the sort of numbers that we see when we look at the economy, just the broad familiar numbers of economic performance. GDP, gross domestic product, the amount of economic activity in an economy in any given year, is 50% below a very conservative trend would have GDP for Myanmar in 2025. In absolute terms, it's still below 2021. And the long term, as well as the short term costs of that, are, of course, extraordinary because you don't get back these lost output. I mentioned Myanmar as the laggard economy of Southeast Asia. We wanted it to be the tiger, etc. Well, I'm not sure that it's even a kitten at the moment. Living standards, again, as mentioned earlier in the context of food, but the number of people living in dire poverty has doubled since the time of the coup. The currency is in free fall, essentially. It's down 80% compared to the value of the JAT in February 2021. From that and from the rampant money printing, that is, again, part of the way that the regime finances its military spending, we've seen rampant inflation. So we've got monetary instability on both fronts, internationally as well as domestically. Growing budget deficits. Now, I mentioned earlier that was one of the singular successes of the NLD government. That's just been completely blown apart. In fact, there's no real, in a sense, there's no constraint on the military regime and its actions in money printing now. At the same time, the debts have dramatically increased. Burma's internal debts have doubled. International debts have increased, all against an economy that is shrinking and much less productive than it used to be. So even those debt levels are much more serious going forward than they might appear even at first glance. Foreign direct investment, as well as local investment, again, has just completely ceased. Now, in the short term, that means less employment, less economic activity, all the issues to do with poverty, etc. But longer term as well, investment is the source of long-term economic growth. That's gone because there's no certainty. There's no trust in the currency. There's no trust in rules and regulations. The only thing that you can trust in is that there'll be some sort of extraction from the regime. So you just don't invest. The labour market. The labour market perverted and distorted now by the whole conscription story. It's impossible really to make any sense of what's taking place in the labour market in Myanmar, with one exception, and that is that people are just desperate to leave it and leave the country along the way. Tourism sector. I mean, gosh, there was a sector of which there were many great hopes, of course, with respect to Myanmar, and we saw it. It was probably, I think, the most visible sign of the transition from 2016. Essentially gone. You've only got a few tourists from Russia, perhaps some from China and so on, but even they, I'm on a number of forums where international tourists come and ask questions about Myanmar, and you can just sense the caution, etc., with respect to that, and the jobs and so on lost for that. Can only be extraordinary, both for the country and the individuals along the way. Now, one could just keep going on because the numbers are, in a sense, all down, dramatically down, continuing to decline. But there's one area of growth, one area of great incline in Myanmar, and that is the growth of the illicit and criminal economy. So we see that soaring because, of course, again, we've got a regime that's not interested in supporting a formal growing economy in which living standards are rising, etc. But we do have one, a government, a regulatory framework that's very interested in any kickbacks that it can get. And so we see the traditional criminal sectors of Myanmar's economy, narcotics, human trafficking, etc., continuing their march upwards. But we've seen innovation as well. The rise of these scam centres on the borders of China and Thailand signify economic growth of a highly destructive sort. And of course, when we say economic growth, we're talking about growth with a negative sign out the front. And I think that concept of an economy that is actually shrinking now and into the future is the legacy that the SAC junta will leave Myanmar.
So we have discussed about what was like before the coup when it comes to the digital rights and digital transformation and the whole sector. So to focus on the present right now and to give you some uh, important points of changes that we are facing right now in the industry because of the coup is first, we can see the most significant collective behavioral change. Uh, it's the technological adaptation of the people before the coup in 2019, 2018, when we provide digital security trainings to the journalists, to the civil society activists. Half of the time we need to spend uh, for convincing that the digital security is important, convincing to use Signal instead of Messenger, etc. But after the coup, we don't need to convince anymore. Digital security became life and death, and millions of people also dramatically moved to the circumvention platforms like Signal and also Telegram. Telegram is I would not call Telegram as a circumvention tech, but also people are a lot of millions of people dramatically became users of those circumvention platforms. And this is indicating that the digital repression activities that the military junta is doing uh, is very strict, and it's also very intense. And the military is using every possible surveillance and digital repression activities to um, to control the information and to control the digital realm. And they are using social media weaponization. They are using internet shutdowns and persecution of online users uh, by setting up the security checkpoints and surveillance and censorship. So these are five categories of digital repression by Stephen Feldstein. And the military is using every um, activity, every methods of the uh, available digital repression activities. And so this is just to give you the magnitude of digital repression in the first place. So, from that context, one of the most pressing problems is that the military is shifting from cost-effective surveillance systems using a little bit of drones, CCTV cameras, and mobile forensic softwares and injecting fear into the society to create the chilling effect. But right now, they are moving onto a full on state surveillance. And in the beginning of the coup, there were reports on media that in the nighttime, the military and the vehicles were come down to the residential areas and they fly drones and also they uh, install CCTV cameras. So these are the level of like uh, cost effective and small scale surveillance systems. But right now, um, they're trying to build centers of calculation like the EID database, SIM registrations, IMEI database, and so that they can better track a person more precisely. And the worst thing is China is backing this up. And right now, the China's company of building the Great Firewall is helping militaries set up the surveillance system. So they are pushing the EID registrations and also the SIM registrations. And this is the effort to triangulate the data of the people. And the worst thing that can impact the society is the policing the mobile banking. So a lot of pro-revolution people got arrested because their bank accounts were monitored, and they are deploying and implementing this kind of surveillance activities by dedicated teams in all of the private banks, and the consequences are dire. If you are suspected uh, of donating money to the revolution forces, your house can be tracked from your uh, national ID, of course, and then your phone number can be tracked, and your location can be revealed. They can come to your house and raid your house and get arrested. We have done a research with IDRC last year about this particular issue, and we witnessed that um, the victims were their money in the bank account were freeze and the houses raid, and in some cases the parents and relatives got arrested because the victim was not there. So uh, this surveillance and advancing in the surveillance system is one of the most pressing uh, problems that we are facing right now. And another pressing problem is the military is getting very good at into the shutdowns. We saw in the news uh, in the beginning of the coup that the soldiers broke into the telecom control rooms, cut the cables, and destroyed the computers to shut down the internet. So they did not know how to properly shut down the internet. Now they are getting very good at it. They can do location-based shutdowns, um, um, time-based shutdown, and everything. So this is uh, the one of the pressing problems that are impacting a lot of uh, socioeconomic activities of the people. And a more advanced surveillance problem is the VPN banning. So the VPN banning in the beginning was, according to our analysis, it was manual. They were banning the IPs of um, the certain VPN protocols. But right now, with the um, new systems, uh, they are using the TSG and Cybernerator they got from China, and these TSG and Cybernators are network level uh, proliferation tools. So right now, the more and more VPNs got banned, and more VPN protocols are getting banned, and the it is going to be ongoing. Right? It is going to be cat and mouse game. Uh, um, if you got new VPN, they are going to shut it down, and you have to find another way to get connected. So right now in Myanmar, if you don't have VPN like 5 to 10 VPNs in your phone, you cannot survive to use in using the digital services. So that is also one of the major challenge for the circumvention. And another like regulatory level and policy level issue is that the communication devices are being criminalized right now in the clearance operations of the online gambling champions. And as you may have informed that the most of the better intensive areas and ethnic revolution armies control areas, uh, there are no internet, and people are using alternative ways of communicating to the internet by using satellite internet, mesh networks, and radio technologies. So when we were relying on those technologies to get connected with our families, to uh, do the documentation of the human rights atrocities, the unfortunately the online gambling gangs were also using the same technology like Starlink, for example, and the uh, neighbor countries like Thailand, they are banning and being most strict on these kind of products because of the clearance operations of the online gambling. So it is going to impose a lot of logistical challenges, especially for the border areas like Karenni, Karen, etc. Uh, when they restore the digital infrastructure, and when they do the rehabilitation processes. And also, another point is the heavy reliance on the Starlink right now. So most of the areas now use Starlink very heavily, and we are not very safe from being banned, and it is a regulatory threat. And Elon Musk has done it for the West African countries. They have cut down the roaming service, and you cannot use it anymore. So it is one of the possibility because we were not officially allowed to use these services. We are, yes, of course, we are giving our payments, like respective payment to monthly or yearly. But when the load is when we have a lot of starting population, it might cause the network interruptions. So if there is a network interruption, it is the job of ISP to load balance. So it can cause because of the load balancing. It can cause because of uh, the SpaceX uh, attitude towards the Myanmar people or other people, and also the U.S. Funding cuts and U.S. Cabinet changes are also happening, and it is a regulatory threat that the Starlink can be cut off. But meanwhile, we don't have any LEO satellite. LEO is low Earth orbit satellite, which is good enough to compete with Starlink because when it comes to satellite, the satellites are not expensive, but the launching is expensive. But Starlink has both of these resources, and they can launch very efficiently than their competitors. So right now, Starlink has a constellation of over 6,000 satellites. The next competitor, OneWeb, only has over 60 satellites. And mostly in the satellite industry, the target audience is not the end user. The target audience is the industry, like marine industry, the aviation industry, etc. The Starlink is the first satellite service which target the end user. That's why their dishes are 599, while others are selling 45,000 US dollars. So that is also main challenge of us, lacking the alternative satellite service when it comes to alternative communication technologies. So these are the challenges that we are having right now at the present time.
So when I was listening to Bradley, particularly talking about surveillance, that actually reminded me of an investigation we did a few months actually after the coup at Lighthouse Reports, that actually found that European companies had sold some top shelf surveillance technology to Myanmar before the coup. And of course, their excuse was that, it was a democratically elected government at that time, which was, for lack of a better word, a BS excuse, because they were selling it to the Ministry of Home Affairs. And we all know that even when the government was democratically elected, we knew that, the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Ministry of Defense were under the control of the military. I mean, anyone with access to Google could have found that. And, we were really worried because that was pretty top shelf surveillance that, allows you to, a lot of them were to crack mobile phones and that were able to sort of recover images and documents and stuff even after you've deleted them. We haven't really followed up on that investigation over the past few years, but we remember, when we did that it was real concern. And yes, obviously China is playing a massive role, but I also think that we really need to push European governments and companies to also block access to that kind of technology to the Myanmar junta. Because all of that, of course, all that Bradley has mentioned just now has an impact on people's ability to access news, and journalists' ability to do any reporting, whether it's inside or outside of the country. There are some areas in Myanmar, like in the dry zone, where the internet cutoff has been going on for so long, it's impossible to do any reporting without actually putting your sources and your journalists in danger. And the coup has pretty much killed independent media almost overnight, right? I mean, I said earlier that journalism has always been a dangerous profession in Myanmar, because even during the country's, fleeting decade of openness, it was a low-paid, thankless job that frequently invited more vitriol than thanks. Many were in it for the passion, definitely not for the wealth. But that situation has deteriorated significantly after the coup, right? Scores of journalists have been harassed, arrested, tortured, and killed. Right from the beginning, the military targeted journalists. They raided the offices of news agencies. They banned media outlets. In fact, the Committee to Protect Journalists' latest census for 2024 found that China, Israel, and Myanmar are the world's 3 worst offenders in terms of jailing journalists because of their work. So the result was that most independent media were forced out of the country and into exile. The vast majority of them are in Thailand along the border. Hundreds of reporters lost their jobs. Many fled and tried to continue working, often living illegally, which brings its own challenges. Those who could not or would not leave the country because of multiple reasons have to keep an extremely low profile and do whatever job that they can find, right? They became taxi drivers, shopkeepers, pretty much anything to make ends meet. If they are continuing, they have to now worry about all the issues around communications, surveillance, mobile phone that Bradley had been talking about, right? If they were going out to do any reporting or meeting, they had to carry multiple phones. They have to have a burner phone. They have to leave the ones with the signal and the VPN at home. And then they have to worry that if anybody raided their homes or their apartments, that will be found. I mean, all of that have left many, many journalists fearing for their lives, as well as mourning this loss of identity, right? Because a lot of, like I said, a lot of people were there for the passion. And I just want to read a few lines from some anonymous diaries that we, the Kitels, have published since 2022. And I quote, "I started living in a state of constant alarm. Even if you lost your job or quit the profession after the coup and are now trying to make a living some other way, this feeling of insecurity remains," unquote. That's from a Yangon-based journalist. And this is from a Shan journalist who was on the run when we were supporting him. Quote, "I was able to flee, but I lost my emotional security. I kept worrying that I'd be arrested and trying to imagine what I should do if I was arrested. When I'm in bed at night and I hear the sound of cars and motorcycles or dogs barking, I get up and check to see if anyone is there. It's been like this since I've been living with this kind of dread," unquote. So the journalists themselves are traumatized, right? But pretty much everyone that I've spoken to in that sector feel that they have a responsibility to continue reporting and writing, because there is also a lot of survivors' guilt that they are safe and the rest of the country is not. They don't want to draw attention to their own plight because they're speaking to victims of air raids and the junta's abuses every day, and they think, who am I to complain? I am still safe. But I really, truly worry about their mental as well as physical health, because many of them have been working pretty much 24/7 since the coup, driven pretty much purely by adrenaline and the sense of responsibility. But that's not sustainable, right? So that's the physical and mental safety of journalists and the state of the industry. But what about the content? There's a bit of a mixed bag, because there's a lot of great stories that have come out. There's a lot of great investigations. There's still a lot of commitment there. But I also fear that some of that is being drowned out by breaking news about the conflict. That is changing. A lot of the news outlets are wanting to do longer stories, not just breaking news and no longer just about conflict, but it is happening quite slowly. There's a need to cover other topics beyond just the conflict, particularly on the business and the economic side, but also on things like what's happening with the environment, health, social issues. But I feel like there's still so much of the attention and focus and energy is on the conflict. Now, also worry that some of the coverage has become extremely partisan and unquestioning. Even in terms of terminology, we're seeing very clear biases creeping in. And I totally understand why this is happening, because, these are journalists who are on the run, like I said, leaving illegally and having to, immerse themselves into what's happening. It's not that they're just reporting as journalists. They themselves, their families, their loved ones, their friends are also affected by the junta's abuses. And also a real key thing is, if you are a journalist from a banned outlet, you cannot speak to the junta. You just cannot. They just won't respond. So, it's totally understandable that some of the stories are one-sided, but I also do worry what it means in the future when the conflict stops and we need to rebuild the country, including having a press and a populace with critical thinking skills, right? One last point, and this is really unfortunate, is that, again, with the dismantling of the USAID, the media, the exile media is now in serious trouble, because they've pretty much lost all sources of external revenue that they used to have while they were in the country, right? So they've been totally reliant on donors. And if you're lucky, you will have some income from subscription fees and donations. But a lot of them have been relying on USAID and State Department funding. Many are having to cut their workforces. Many journalists I know are currently working without pay. Even those who have jobs are really, really anxious about what's going to happen to them in the next couple of months. It is heartbreaking, because essentially Trump and Musk may succeed in killing off independent media, and that is only going to help Min Aung Hlaing and the junta in the long term.
On the energy front, so remember how I mentioned that we knew that there was this crisis coming, and in 2019, 2020, the NLD government took a raft of measures, emergency measures, to try to avoid a major crisis. And the key thing there is that these emergency measures depended on private sector investment, because there needed a lot of capital, which the state didn't have. And it needed stability and safe a safe business environment in which at least you can build safely, recover your investment. And if you're a foreign investor, clear rules for repatriating some of your profits in foreign currency abroad. Now, what happens with the coup is that the investor confidence, as Sean said earlier, investor confidence was just shattered. There was, I think, a short window of time in 2021 between the coup and, I would say, July, where a lot of investors were waiting and seeing what was happening. And there's a very important thing that happens in July, which is that the Chinese company that was generating about a third of the electricity in Myanmar, decides this is too risky now. The currency depreciation is out of control. It's not only that the currency was losing value, it was that it was out of control. And they didn't see a route out of this anytime soon. Global energy prices were on the rise. And so they decide, we're putting everything on pause. And a few months later, they decide, we're going to leave Myanmar altogether. And that, for the entire sector, was really the canary in the coal mine. Because this company, which has taken major risks during the transition period to try to invest and build a lot of power supply in Myanmar, they were the pioneers, and they decided, okay, this is no longer feasible. All the other companies took stock of this. And so most investors left. And not only the Western companies. I think this is where the unique dimension, the unique aspect of the scale of the failure of the SAC is in its inability to retain regional investors. That back in 2021, I think a lot of Chinese, Vietnamese, Taiwanese, Thai, Singaporean investors would have been perfectly fine staying or actually entering the Burmese market, even under junta rule. There was no kind of ideological objection to that. Very quickly, they understood that this regime either had no idea what it was doing, or knew what it was doing but was completely failing to implement it, or actually had no interest in economic development whatsoever. What the SAC started doing was announcing a lot of projects. So they started saying, okay, we're going to build this dam, this gas plant, we're going to revive this old project, we're going to announce a lot of new solar plants and gas plants, and to project this facade of business as usual. And then nothing happened. And a lot of what they were announcing started to seem a bit hollow, despite the fact that foreign media coverage assigned a lot of credibility to these announcements for lack of context. Very quickly, it sounded like, okay, actually, they're not really serious here. They're trying to play these very basic games of like, okay, if we announce this project, then this is going to keep Chinese investors in the country. But of course, the Chinese investors are somewhat more sophisticated than that and saw right through it. and decided, no, this is not the moment to scale up anything. It's initially they thought, okay, we're going to put everything on ice. We're going to wait a little bit and see where it goes. And when the currency continued to depreciate, when contracts started to be broken by the SAC, when payments were not made to existing companies, contractors who had contracts with the Ministry of Electricity and Energy, later renamed the Ministry of Electric Power, all of this signaled a very negative business environment. And so they either all left or kept a very small kind of skeleton team in country, but just to maintain a presence, perhaps to negotiate land lease agreements for future projects and things like that, so that they don't lose their whole advantage from being early entrants. But there was no, I think by early 2022, all prospects of investing, fixing the energy crisis in Myanmar is over. And the SAC is on its own by that point. And what happens is exactly what had been planned, what had been expected in the transition period, which is the energy crisis I mentioned earlier. So between 2022 and 2024, the gas supply from the biggest gas field in the country drops by 45%. The power supply in the country drops by 35%. Probably in this year, by the time we get to end of May, we're probably going to hit the milestone of a 50% drop compared to 2021. So in available electricity capacity. So in a nutshell, if I summarize what happened is, before the coup, there was the expectation that we were coming to the end of a cycle, of an energy cycle, that these gas reserves were going to be depleted, and there desperately needed to be emergency measures to help transition to a new cycle based on new types of investment, new types of energy. What the coup does is that it interrupts this transition phase. And suddenly, the mega crisis, the energy crisis that had been forecasted, happens, and not only happens, but is metastasized by the conflict and by the loss of control. And I think that sometimes when I look at what the SAC has been trying to do in the energy sector, I'm sometimes wondering, well, are they trying and failing, or are they just not trying? And I think it's actually a bit of both. Every time that they have tried something, they have confronted the harsh reality that they actually don't control much anymore. They don't control. They don't control the country enough. They don't control the economy enough to fix basic infrastructure issues. The power grid is falling apart in big parts of the country due to lack of maintenance, because engineers can't access the sites because it's too dangerous, because there's also no budget for it. They can't control the territory enough to convince Chinese investors to come back and invest in solar plants. We have just about 15 minutes from Mandalay. There's a huge solar plant there built by Power China that is now abandoned. There's just a lack of control overall. And this is why I think that, I mean, I'm going ahead of myself here, but I think that that's the underlying problem looking ahead, is that even if they want to try to fix this, they don't have the basic level of control that would allow them to come up with, the silver bullet to implement in this context. It's just become too messy and too out of control for them.
And for the education sector, I think we can just have a quick look at the government expenditure for the Ministry of Education. So for the during the NLD government, I think the education budget peaked at around 8.4%, 8.5% in 2019-2020. And that figure for 2022-2023 was barely 2%. And that statistic came with a footnote saying that this is only for the areas where there is no social unrest, and where the SAC could still have some sort of authority and control. So I'm not sure how reliable these figures are. So the current priority of the SAC includes nothing of trying to educate the young people for the next generation, and I wouldn't be surprised if that spending on education and health continue to decline in the next years if they are still in power. So when we're trying to assess how the education sector was impacted after the coup, so in the aftermath of the coup, in the days and weeks following the news of the military takeover, as we all might remember, the civil disobedience movement was the initial response from the public, from the civil servants, from all the protest movement that were flooding, all the streets across the country. So there were initially the number of CDM teachers and university professors peaked. It reached almost around 85% of the workforce, but gradually, because of the pressures and coercions from the government authorities or from their families or for many other economic reasons, that number actually settled around 55% of the workforce. So 55% of the teachers and the university professors have not rejoined their workforce. They have not gone back to their workplaces. They have not continued working under the regime. And subsequently, in a few months, by around May and June of 2021, the SSC has officially fired all of them who have not showed up to work since then. And moreover, they have also criminalized the CDM personnel, so they can't make a passport, they can't travel through the airports and these official ports of travel. They are banned from finding a job in the private sector, and they have been targeted with a variety of prosecutions and criminalizations since they joined CDM, and many of those criminal penalties have remained. They have not revoked. So these CDM professors, they are also the backbone of the alternative education programs that have emerged since the coup, so including the programs that were running at Spring University, as well as many of the NUG's education initiatives. If we want to look at how the number of students and the teachers that have been impacted by that, the SAC has regularly published how they are trying to regain control of the territory, how many of the students are returning to the campuses, and etc., just to paint a picture of their political legitimacy, as well as just trying to showcase, the country is going back to normal, but that is far from the truth. Now, many of their official figures are somewhat arguable, but one strong indicator that we can look at would be the matriculation exam takers. So as I was saying, the SEC's Ministry of Education and the government reports have released some official figures for how many students have rejoined the classes, how many teachers have returned, but I would always take these numbers with a grain of salt. But one indicator that could be used to estimate how many students are back in the system would be the matriculation exam, which marks the completion of the basic education. In the previous decade, between 2010 and 2020, normally around 900,000 to 1 million students would take that exam, but that figure dropped to 180,000 in 2022, 120,000 in 2023, and 130,000 in 2024. So that's more than 85% fewer number of exam takers that are joining these SAC's matriculation exam. We can see what will be the numbers for this year. So they're going to have that exam in the second and third weeks of March. They have already released that this year around 200,000 have registered for their exams, which seems like a slight increase from the previous 2 or 3 years, but it's still a much smaller number compared to the regular exam takers of around 1 million students that would have been there in 2018 and 2019. So I think it is still safe to assume that the majority of the students have not gone back to the SEC's education system, and the majority of the teachers have also not gone back to their work, and they have been fired. And at this point, I'm not sure if there's any pathway for SEC to bring them back, or any motivation from the teachers to rejoin their previous positions. And this trend is also amplified by how the young people view this movement. So the university age young people, initially, it was entirely political, because all of us have a friend or a family or a familiar face who have been shot and wounded while they were protesting, or who has been arrested, who has joined the PDF or the local defense forces. So it was back in 2022, it was entirely unthinkable, for us to even associate with this regime. But now it has been a bit over 4 years, and a student who was 12 years old back in 2021 would now be 16, and they are now being pressured by the economy, by their families, trying to put food on the table. So the kind of peer pressure and the political consideration have sort of toned down, although it's still there, and it's already always at the back of our head. But because they now have more urgent needs that they need to address, some of them might choose to go back to these classes if these programs could guarantee any income generation activity, if they could get a job after this, if they can use the degree to go abroad, to go for further studies abroad, etc. So I think this is also the space where the alternative education programs and the SAC programs are currently competing, because when, say, SUM, the Spring University Myanmar, initially started, what we offer was, just an alternative for the young people to not go back to SAC schools, and trying to support the CDM professors, and trying to find other viable pathways for their lifelong learning. But right now, when a young person or a student is contemplating between going back to SAT school or joining this alternative education programs, it is more of a practical consideration of how much they can earn after this, how much they could use these credentials and certificates. And many of the alternative education programs have also stepped up. Ethnic education programs in particular have been championing, and they have really stepped up to accommodate the huge influx of displaced populations, as well as young people who are being trained in the ethnic areas, or who have relocated to the liberated fronts. So ethnic education institutions are accommodating more and more young people who are trying to flee the SAC system, and then they're also optimistic of finding further studies abroad in neighboring countries, or trying to make a career out of it. So in summary, though, if we would look at the number of teachers or the number of students who are still operating within the SAG system, it is still a very small number compared to what was there prior to the coup, and there is no prospect for the remaining students or the faculty members to return to these workforces, and instead, many of these teachers and students have organized themselves through various platforms to be a part of the resistance, many of them in the education sector, but also in other facets of the revolution, be it fundraising or advocacy or getting the message out there, citizen journalists, defense forces, and all kinds of resistance matters that are at their disposal. And many of these alternative programs have also proved to be innovative, because they normally are heavily reliant on online learning programs because there isn't any sort of secure physical space for them to operate within the country. But it could also mean that for students and communities that do not have internet coverage, it is very hard for them to access these alternative programs. But in that regard, there have been new ways of delivering these lessons, be it radio lectures or other analog technologies or hybrid technologies where they could combine the offline learning materials as well as online learning, sort of asynchronous interaction whenever there is some form of internet connection. So I think we can expect more of these creative programs emerging as we have more liberated areas and more students and teachers get more resources in that. Regarding the USAID fiasco and how it was carried out and how it was just abruptly just cut off, many of the education programs, especially by the ethnic education institutions and mother tongue based like basic education programs, those are entirely supported through like this USAID and other humanitarian and development assistance, and they're currently in no position to collect tuition fees or any kind of revenues from the students, from the beneficiaries. So we could also expect a new form of revenue generation. It could be through crowdfunding, it could be through other means of tax revenue or commerce or any other ways of supporting these public service provisioning activities, including healthcare and education. And I think we can expect a drastic change in many of these alternative programs.
Thank you so much for each of your contributions. You've all gone into such extraordinary depth, and you all definitely know your subjects very well as well. And we're benefiting from your insight and your analysis and your proximity to these important topics, even as we say that the information you're sharing is absolutely devastating. It shouldn't come as a surprise for many of us that are following, but simply still just to hear detail after detail after detail of an imperfect progress, a cautious optimism, rough aspirations before the coup into really just devastation after devastation of every category. And it's but as hard as this is to hear, it's very important to know these details, and I thank you for sharing them. We have one final question, and I, again, just want to appreciate your time and the depth and detail that you've gone over for these. And as this conversation is looking at trajectories of different paths, interrupted paths, and hopefully renewal, and greater aspirations, the final question is, let's look ahead and let's dare to imagine a future where, for whatever reason, the regime is no longer in power. What would be the most urgent priorities in your sector to rebuild and move forward? And what opportunities might arise in a post-military Myanmar? What groundwork needs to be laid now to prepare for that future? What are your major challenges and concerns?
So here's a ray of hope after all the depressing stuff that we have heard and have discussed and talked about. So I was talking about, speaking to this veteran development professional, right, who's been working with farmers. And they also told me that in the townships and areas in Sagaing, in the dry zone, where the resistance has pretty much taken over and that fighting has calmed down, they're actually seeing farmers reinvesting in their land, in their livelihoods, and that farming activities are picking up again, right? So, if we can tackle that insecurity and instability, other we can get back on track pretty quickly. But that's not all. And this is a big but, because there is a lot of other work that needs to be done. First of all, we really need to rethink our agricultural policy. It can't only be about yields, cash crops, export-oriented production, or the glory days of the Rice Bowl of Southeast Asia, right? It has to be about growing healthy, nutritious, and affordable food for our own people in a way that is also environmentally sustainable and provides a decent income for farmers and a livable wage for agriculture workers. We need to do it using fewer synthetic inputs, meaning fewer chemical pesticides and fertilizers, because they're bad both for our health and for the health of our environment. We need to do it without destroying our mangroves and forests. We also need to make the whole job more attractive to younger people so that they see a future in farming, right? We need to support the food sovereignty for indigenous groups and indigenous people who want to keep their traditions alive. And we need to really make sure that people have access to food, that they can utilize the food, and that there's stability for their access, utilization, and availability. Right? And food security and nutrition aren't just about what happens on the farm. We need to think about the rest of the value chain, the processing, the transportation, the retail, and the consumption and waste management all around it, because there are government policies associated with each and every part of that to reform them, to make them, like I said, in a way that will encourage producing healthy, nutritious, affordable food for our people. There are also greenhouse gas emissions embedded in every single part of that value chain. So if we want to, make sure that they're environmentally sustainable, we need to address that as well. That's why we can't just focus narrowly on agriculture when we rebuild. We need to see it as a system, as food systems, right? And whenever I talk about the transformation of food systems at a global level, I say that we're facing three main challenges. How do we make them healthier, greener, and fairer? And that's also how we should be thinking about rebuilding our agriculture and food systems in Myanmar as well. That means we also need to be thinking about food environments. And when I say that, I'm not talking about just the physical environment in which we live, but the political and social environments that influence our diets and what we eat, what we buy, and how we eat them. So, thinking of ways to encourage the production of healthy food and healthy eating, whether through incentives or through, tax and regulatory instruments on unhealthy foods. We need to think about that. That's the kind of thing that Latin American countries are now really starting to do. We also need to make sure that our food system isn't so heavily concentrated that a handful of companies own everything. These are some of the biggest issues that we need to think about. So there's a lot of work to be done, but the good thing is we already know what to do and what needs to be done. We just need to be given the opportunity to do it.
In many ways, my comments about the economy post the regime are very, very similar to what Then said just then. So, in the short term, I'm quite optimistic when we're talking about recovery, because most of the terrible economic decisions, the terrible economic outcomes, are a direct function of this regime, the nature of it, its priorities, etc. So the removal of that regime, in many ways, is self-correcting. So I spoke earlier about the regime's efforts to try and expropriate foreign exchange. Well, you just end that and you remove immediately a massive disincentive for exporters and for international trade more broadly. You remove some of the restrictions on importers, for instance, which would mean then Myanmar can start importing some of the inputs it needs to the production process. You dramatically increase military spending, one would imagine, with the replacement of that regime, which then gives an enormous boost to the macro economy, much more fiscal space for health, education, spending, etc. So all the good things that growth would deliver growth would return very, very quickly with the removal of the regime. It created the problems. Its removal would thereby bring many of those to an end. The other thing for optimism, I think, now moving a bit to the longer term, and this again echoes what Thin said a moment ago, is that intellectually it's not difficult. The program that was embarked upon in 2016, I think, is still sound and still highly relevant. Indeed, that program was revisited after COVID well, in the middle of COVID actually, and a recovery plan worked out from that, which was sort of an update on the basic plan of driving growth, etc., but with the aspect, if you like, of an economy really brought down. At that time, because of COVID, obviously something different now. So intellectually, it's not difficult. But it's still going to be a hard slog in practice. We might know what to do. We can run any number of mantras about what is needed for Myanmar to become an open, prosperous economy, but you're still going to face many of the headwinds before. There's still going to be a public service, for instance, that I would imagine is going to be resistant to change. We're going to see lots of, if you like, muscle damage to Myanmar's productive output. People have lost education. People obviously have lost all sorts of other things that make them productive. So that's going to be a problem. So all of that's still there. So, it will certainly be a hard slog. But here we come to a critical question for economics, the economy, but I think more broadly, what is the nature of the removal of that regime? In other words, is it complete or is it incomplete, as it was in 2016? And what I worry about would be some sort of removal of the regime, maybe only the top part of that regime, but the persistence of the structural entities that have kept Myanmar under military rule for, most of the time since independence. And if those don't change, then a lot of those old pathologies, excessive spending on the military, a system that is overly centralised and which the states and regions don't get the sort of fiscal federal justice that I mentioned earlier. So if that's where we end up, in some sort of compromised regime, then the recovery itself, it seems to me, will be compromised. And given that the economy is sunk so low, it's difficult to be that optimistic about long-term growth in Myanmar. If, on the other hand, the regime is completely defeated, we have, if you like, an unconditional surrender of the military, then it seems to me that in the long term, as well as in the short term, we can be optimistic because, again, the pathologies that come from all that time of military rule in Myanmar would at last be addressed. So I guess I want to end on saying that, I look at the economy now and it's a travesty, it's a tragedy, but there is hope and it's plausible hope, but it does presuppose, it seems to me, the total defeat of the SAC junta.
So, after discussing the present challenges, if we are looking ahead to the era of post SAC era, when it comes to digital infrastructure and digital transformation, it's not a major sector comparing to the sectors like the food and energy and etc. But one thing that might be a bottleneck is that if we don't restore the communication infrastructure, it can become a huge roadblock for other rebuilding and development networks. So after the revolution, like after the military has been brought down, the short-term goal in the digital transformation is to rebuild the infrastructure because according to writers, almost 400 towers were destroyed in 2021 alone, and it will take a large capital and labor to rebuild these communication networks. And we could not take the communication infrastructure for granted because if you compare to everything before 2012 telecommunication reform, and after the reform, the interaction of the societies, the quality of life of the communities and also the economic developments in the country are is not comparable. That's why we need to rebuild the infrastructure first thing. But as Sean has mentioned, uh, we need to know, is it a complete brought down of the military, or is it incomplete? Because the infrastructure is now 100% owned and controlled by the military affiliated organizations. So if we are going to restore the networks and rebuild the network itself, are we going to merge with the existing networks? How about the ownership of the previously owned military affiliated organizations? What are we going to do? It will depend so much on that. But if we are to rebuild the existing infrastructure and then integrate it with the alternative option of the other communication channels, it will be the best case scenario. So this is otherwise it will be a roadblock for other rebuilding and development works. Because, for example, the currency, if we are the EROs, if EROs were about to build up currencies inside the country to make transactions and in the daily lives of the public, it is very expensive to print money, fiat money. So in the world's printing money is controlled by the mostly the Swiss companies, and the Swiss companies like called Koenig and Bauer, they claim they are responsible for 90% of the money printing, and one of their printers costs around 40 million euros. So it is impossible, economically not viable to print fiat money. So if we look at the digital money, it is feasible. It's not that expensive to develop one. But uh, on the other hand, the infrastructure is broken. So these digital monies and digital currencies depends on the EROs, revolution, the ethnic revolution organizations are going to uh, build up their own currencies. For example, the printing money is not very economically viable anymore. So money printer, Swiss made money printer can cost around 40 million euros. So it is economically not viable. It doesn't include any other things in the process yet. It is extremely expensive. So if you look at the digital money, it is feasible. It's not that expensive. But on the other hand, the infrastructure is broken. So it can become like chicken and egg when it comes to restoring the digital infrastructure. And these are the restoring the infrastructure is the short term goal that um, we can make. But for the long term, we need to backcast and see the systemic causes of internet shutdowns and every digital repression happening in Myanmar today. So the military's intentional internet shutdowns are not only the standing reason for the internet inaccessibility. Infrastructure damage and taking over of the telecom sector by the military affiliated companies are also the reasons why the internet became so vulnerable to the shutdowns. And the one of the root causes of these internet being very easily manipulated is the telecom sector was monopolized in most of the countries in the world. Most of the telecom sectors are monopolized because it is capital intensive. But in other countries, with the policies implementations like USF, Universal Service Fund, there are, rather than the conventional infrastructure-based communication networks, they also have alternative communication networks like community networks, which are the networks built by the community, owned by the community, and used by the community. So that's why their networks became more resilient and also become more heterogeneous. So in Myanmar, when we were discussing about the things happening in the before the coup, USF Universal Service Fund and Universal Service Strategy was one of the things that was ongoing, and with that we can. We were in the beginning of the heterogeneous networks, but it stopped because of the coup. So our telecom evolution didn't go there yet. So we were stopped at the conventional infrastructure-based networks. So right now, what we um, need to aim is the heterogeneous networks, meaning to say avoiding and depending on the one method or one way of networks, which is conventional 4G, 3G infrastructures. Uh, we need to aim for the heterogeneous networks with alternative network options. And another long-term strategy that we can aim for the future federal democracy country is the currencies, decentralized currencies. So right now, basically, we are buying the commodity that is the printed money by the SAC. So to do the rebuilding and everything inside the country, we always ended up with the last mile currency, which is Myanmar jets, which is the product of the central bank of Myanmar, the SAC. So if we cannot escape from the that currency, we are bound by this currency. Um, it will be a lot harder to take out the SAC from the economy. So for the long term, the revolution forces should have their own currencies. So we need to figure out how and in what ways we are doing this. And the last thing that I want to point out is the technological adaptability of the people. So, because of the revolution and because of the digital repressions activities imposed by the military, people become more resilient and people become more adapted to new technologies. So, we need to leverage that adaptability of the public and introduce new technologies such as Web3, blockchain, cryptocurrencies, etc. Because we're on the verge of next technological revolution. when we were using the postal service before the emails, and the emails and the Web 2 internet just developed in like a decade, and it changes the way we work, the way we communicate with each other. So we are on the verge of next step of the technological revolution. So in for our societies to be relevant in the future workforces, we need to introduce more uh, new technologies to the society by leveraging the technology adaptability gained in this revolution. And these are the points that we can foresee and strategize for the new Myanmar. And in terms of optimism, um, we my personal optimism is like uh, we are on the edge of decentralization politically, technologically. We are on the edge of the decentralization. If you look at the macro history, we are on the in the circle of centralization and decentralizations. So this is going to be another phase of decentralizations. If it is true, we are not very late, and maybe if we are fortunate, we may be one step ahead of other countries, because they still need to. If we look at the world, the global events, all these wars happening, and the technological advancements which disrupts the society and give headaches uh, to the most brightest and brilliant scientists and technologists. These things are all of the signs of decentralization. And those countries who are already established first need to be it's hard to find a word, destroyed or like dissolved first. So maybe it is a bit naive optimism, but I think if those contexts are true, we can be ahead of other countries. And from this revolution, from this massive uh, um, kind of repressions and all the forces, we can become like the next country which shows the world how to organize the new models of states and new digitalities.
So, in terms of journalism, the first thing I would say we should do is abolish the Ministry of Information. Seriously. We should have functioning and competent media departments and spokespersons in each ministry and government agency. But I don't think we should have room for a Ministry of Information. We also need to scrap the government's mouthpiece media outlets. You can have public service broadcasting for sure, and we should. But MRTV and the New Light of Myanmar, the way it has been working, aren't it. In some ways, this is very, very similar to the structural issues that Sean mentioned earlier when it comes to, the economic realm. It is so important that I think when we restart, we do it right, and we make sure that the old structures that kept Myanmar's people access to information and journalists' ability to report oppressed, we need to change those structures. We also really need both the public, the policymakers, and the media itself to understand that we should not want a pliant press, and we should question anyone who does. It's not the job of the press to make the country looks good. Our job is to report what is happening accurately and fairly, and we really need to make sure everybody understands that, including the journalists themselves. And in that same vein, I think we need the journalists and media to remember that we're not in journalism just for journalism's sake, right? We're not just here for scoops and awards and taking down people. Again, this might sound naive, but I think it is so, so important that we remember the core mission of why we are doing this job. And here I want to actually quote an American journalist called Candace Fortman, who runs a local media outlet in the States, who said, and I quote here, "Saving journalism has never been the job. The mission has always been to protect communities from an onslaught of predatory, violent, and deeply unjustifiable policies, companies, and systems that exploit our neighbors and prioritize profit over people. We are also charged with uplifting the brilliance of our neighbors, the history of our places, and the creative pulse that lives all around us." End quote. We really need to keep that in mind, that we're doing this in a way to make sure that the people who have the power cannot exploit the people who don't. Obviously, there are questions around the long-term viability of journalism itself, but that remains a big question all over the world. And that's, something that we're grappling with, not just in Myanmar. And we may need to come up with different permutations in which, the media journalism can remain independent and questioning, but also be profitable or at least self-sustaining. But I do want to say that if there is a silver lining among all of this horror, it is that people seem to have realized the value of independent media, because before the coup, especially in the wake of what's happening in Rakhine and the atrocities against the Rohingya, there were a lot of people in Myanmar, ordinary people in Myanmar, ordinary readers, who thought that journalists were sensationalizing or worse, lying about what was happening. But I think they have realized the value of independent journalism and media, and I am hoping that knowledge and sense of why it is so important that media remains independent will prevail and continue. And that's, we really need to nurture and nourish that knowledge and sense.
And I also have some similar optimistic outlook on the education sector as well. Now that the USAID has been dismantled, and there seems to be a lot of challenges in terms of how we're going to be financing many of these activities at a time when there are no possible revenue generation activities that we could collect from the students or the state or from the community. There will be a number of challenges in terms of building better infrastructure, building better learning facilities, as well as trying to equip our teachers and the faculty members and the researchers with the right skill set to be driving this education reform forward. So I think the biggest challenge that has persisted in the 10 years before and that has continued to persist these days is that there seems to be a fundamental difference in understanding between Naypyidaw and the ethnic education stakeholders, let's just say. And that kind of difference runs from all the way from the top bureaucrats and the policymakers to everyday people on both sides. But this spring movement has somehow shaken it up and sort of bring these people closer. We can see that in how many of these ethnic education institutions have opened up to this influx of displaced populations and people from the NUG and people from all walks of life who would traditionally not oppose any policies coming out of Naypyidaw. So I hope that this kind of understanding and mutual partnership would continue, and that was one of the areas that was in demand by the student protests back in 2014, 2015. That was one of the areas that apparently was not finalized in drafting the National Education Strategic Plan, but it seems like this this has more prospects than ever before. And I think once we have resolved these differences and trying to have a truly comprehensive national education plan, I think we can follow up other technical requirements of building better schools and trying to have a more inclusive system throughout the country. So I hope we could maintain that momentum. I hope we have more closer collaborations and understanding between the central authority figures and the ethnic and those education platforms that are active along the border, that are outside of the central system, and we can create a truly comprehensive system for all the children, all the young learners, and all the students in the country. Thank you.
I know for a lot of podcast listeners, as soon as the fundraising requests start up, you just kind of zone out till it's over and skip ahead. But if you're taking the time to listen to our full podcast, can I ask that you also take a moment to listen to our spiel? Because the reality is, creating this content takes immense effort and resources. And if you make a donation or contribution, you'll not just be helping to keep this podcast going, you'll also be standing in solidarity with the people of Myanmar during one of the most challenging periods in their history. Please take a look at insightmyanmar.org/donation for more details.